Hi everyone, welcome. Thanks for coming along to this session for a discussion about a subject that's becoming increasingly more important as technology becomes more pervasive in our lives, the ethics of technology. And when we think about ethics and technology, maybe we think about the Cambridge Analytica scandal when there was a lot of questions raised about how our social media data is being used, or robo-debt, which has raised questions about the impacts of automated decision-making. And then there's the question, when we're talking about ethics, of whose ethics we're talking about. So there's plenty of examples where bias has been baked into technologies and leading to unjust outcomes. But there are ways we can design technology to create a more inclusive future. And here to talk about that is our wonderful panel. So we've got Angie Abdilla, a Palawa woman and the CEO of Old Ways New, a company that draws on Indigenous knowledge to inform the development of technologies for both the public and private sector. We've got Bill Simpson-Young. He's the Chief Executive of the Gradient Institute, which is a not-for-profit research institute working on the design and development of ethical AI systems. And Dana Bradford, a Senior Research Scientist at CSIRO's Australian eHealth Research Centre, where her work focuses on digital services for equitable healthcare. And Angie, I think we'll start with you. So Australia's home to some of the oldest technologies on Earth, ancient technologies developed by Indigenous Australians. Can you talk us through Aboriginal approaches to technology and how we could all benefit if this kind of approach was adopted more widely?
Yeah, so I think we typically think about technology in I guess a post-digital realm, but what I like to bring people back to is the broader definition around technology beyond zeros and ones. And when we think about this continent here that we're on today, where the Aboriginal people are the oldest living continuum of culture and peoples on this planet. So that's a really, it's important to really sink into that and actually just be present with that for a moment, because if we think about this continent being the driest continent on Earth, there's obviously some really deep, sophisticated knowledges that have survived, not just having survived ice ages, but having nurtured 6,000 or more generations of our ancestors. So that's, I think, quite profound when we really contemplate that. So, of course, the design and development principles behind those various different technologies that have evolved over those that very long history have got inherent social and environmental sustainability principles baked into them. So I think that's the key to what defines Indigenous technologies and Western technologies, what the key thing that's quite different between them.
And I think you've sort of talked about how when Aboriginal cultures are approaching technology, you're sort of talking about this idea of seeing the human as part of the environment, whereas in Western culture, sometimes the human's sort of put above the environment. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so what I typically do when we're describing this sort of these different paradigms, these different worldviews, is I like to show these two diagrams, and typically one is a triangle where you can see man and all the various different things that man sits on top of within a Western hierarchical system. And those, all those various different other entities are plant and animal and all things. That's typically how Western systems have evolved when you think about social systems, justice systems, health systems, environmental system management, resource management. All systems typically have evolved from that hierarchical, patriarchal manner. Whereas from an Indigenous perspective, it's largely flat and not always matricentric, but often it's matriarchal. And it's a relational, contextual, interrelational dynamic that we have with country. So we come from country, whereas man has typically evolved from the eye of God as having dominion over all things. So it's about a different way of understanding your relationship with other things, all things, animate, inanimate.
And so that's kind of the starting point. So can you tell us a little bit about your work and what you do? And
Yeah,
starting point?
so Old Ways New is a company that that was incorporated about 3 years ago. A number of years prior to that of deep research, founded the company. I guess we weren't even really on a mission to develop a company. It was really more so about a question that was driving us: how Indigenous knowledges and systems can inform new emerging technologies. So the company evolved out of that question because we wanted to make sure that we were modelling economic independence. So we're a proprietary limited company, and we wanted to also make sure that we're modelling I guess, more progressive. A progressive agenda that is beyond the access and participation agenda that most organisations or initiatives are focusing Indigenous technologies around. You know, we're not talking, I mean, it's not to disregard the need for access and participation in various different programs and initiatives. That's a real, you know, that exists, that is a real problem that needs solving. But what we're looking at is how Indigenous knowledges and systems can inform the emerging technologies based on these two core principles: that our knowledges and systems are socially and environmentally sustainable and have nurtured, you know, thousands and thousands of generations of people on this dry continent.
And just thinking about why ethics is such an important consideration in developing technology, Bill, from your work, can you share some examples or experiences of how technology can lead to unethical or non-inclusive outcomes?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of examples that, I mean, if you read the papers, you'll have seen some, you know, lots of high-profile examples. You mentioned before things like Robodebt and so on, but a lot of them, often it's the use of new technologies in a way that isn't. A lot of new technology is really attractive, and people want to use machine learning and so on. They've got lots of data. They've got machine learning. It's easy to get machine learning tools. It's easy to stick some data together with some tools and make some predictions and do some interventions based on that. But if you don't have good human governance over those systems, lots of things can go wrong. And there's tip of the iceberg of the types of things that you see in the papers, but there's some really big systematic disadvantages being created by some of these technologies. A great paper released earlier this year at a conference in Atlanta on fairness, accountability and transparency in machine learning, which was a case study where they'd taken data. There was 70 million people in the US who were in a particular US healthcare program where they were determining a risk score from the individuals in this program. And from those individuals, if the risk score was over a certain amount, then they would get case managed, you know, with their healthcare. Now, it turned out that the researchers who did the study got the data and actually looked at people's actual health, what was happening in the system. They were taking a proxy for people's health to be the cost of their healthcare. And it turns out there's a big disparity between the cost of African Americans' healthcare and the cost of non-African American healthcare. And it was actually disadvantaging the black Americans 2 to 1 about whether they got into this case management program just from bad system design and bad risk scoring and bad governance of that system. But those sort of things, this happening everywhere, and people just don't realise because everyone, you know, tech is so attractive, it's cool. People get paid lots of money to build tech. They'll oversell their capabilities. You know, it's cool to be a data scientist. Everyone's calling themselves a data scientist when they don't really get data, and there's just lots of big issues happening. And this is why we created the Great Institute, to try to address some of these.
Yeah. And did you have some examples as well, Dana, of where tech can go wrong?
Yeah, I think when you first introduce technology, that's when you're likely to have most of the problems. I think most people in this room are really familiar with the example of when Siri first came out. And if you said to Siri that you were feeling depressed and that you thought you'd jump off a bridge, she would respond with the closest 4 bridges are, which is probably not ideal for what we're looking for in a responsive technology. But it was something that the developers just did not consider, hadn't thought of. It was fixed really, really quickly. Nowadays, all the chatbots have a little gatekeeper in them that throws to a human, like, is this a conversation or they should have, if they don't, have code in them that if you're bringing up keywords, depressed, feeling blue, those sorts of things, it says, would you like to speak to a human rather than anything else? So I think we've come a long way since Siri first came in, but that's the kind of things that we focus when we first build technologies.
And then sort of thinking about how do we counteract some of these things, and particularly we've talked about how bias can sort of make its way into code and things like that. How can we stop that sort of thing from happening?
So in a research environment, it's really important to fully understand the population for whom you are building the technology, and even more importantly, it should be with whom you are building the technology rather than for. So I think if you identify your population group that you want to work with, and that you have either a collaboration with those people or those people are actually on the research team, however that works, whether they're in one institute or whether they're collaborating institutes, and that there's co-design right from the very beginning. And the best way for it to be developed is for it to be, the idea to be originated within the population group that the technology is being designed for, and then the software developers and the designers are meeting that need that's there, but working hand in hand right through the development process, and that it's trialled really extensively with lots of different population groups that are that are related to that population that you're targeting, and then having it going out there. In terms of the ethics side of it, from a research perspective, having everybody involved in the ethics process, so everybody on the team, no matter what they do as part of that team, they're involved in writing the ethics for it. So we're currently doing some work at the moment that has a neuroimaging component, a bioassay component, a obstetrician component, and we're looking at babies, and a number of other supervisory components. I've made every single one of them, even the professors, be involved in the ethics application. They've all got a section they need to fill out. And I think having people involved right from the start is one way of helping to counteract some of that bias.
And Angie, how do you sort of counteract bias when you're working with Indigenous communities? I think you mentioned the knowledge verification process.
Yeah. So I've gone off mic. I think what we centre on is a process that we've developed within our company called country-centred design. So it comes back to this understanding that we are part of country, country is part of us. And when we talk about country, it's land, water, sky. It's all things in sky, in earth. It's all things. It's not just earth or nation or state. So country-centred design is a process that ensures that we're looking at the whole entire systems associated with and within that context, so within country and within that community. So first of all, we start with the question, okay, whose country are we on? How do we acknowledge that? Who are the traditional custodians of this place, and how do we forge relationships with them? Who are the elders then that they identify that need to be involved in that process? Who are then the other community members and organisations that need to be involved? How are they, first of all, inviting us in? Because we don't go into communities otherwise, even as an Indigenous woman. And then, are they identifying the problem, or is it somebody else? And then, how are those traditional knowledges of place and relating to country able to inform the research that we develop, and what other sector-relevant knowledges do we then plug in to that research body? How then does that inform the strategy, so what are the different modalities that we're applying to resolve that problem in a co-design way with communities? And then the technology only comes at the very end. We don't even mention technology until we've gone through that really rigorous process, and that can take years sometimes before we even talk about technology. So it's about creating the law, and very much, similar to ethics, we talk about law, and when we're talking about law, L-O-R-E, not L-A-W. And what we're talking about is developing the law for each of those projects, or the dreaming. So, everything has dreaming and law, so other dreaming and law can sometimes be interchangeable. And it means that there's a common story and an understanding of how we all collectively understand this problem state and situation and how we're going to all work together.
I was just talking to Angie just before about something I was just involved in that was really impressive, which was I was on an assessment panel for the New Zealand government on investing in New Zealand data science research, and they brought the Maori perspective in very early stage in this whole process, so that all of the proposals for funding under this data science research thing, and this is for actually progressing New Zealand's data science, were that they had to consider the Maori perspective to data, and that includes different forms of ownership, Maori data sovereignty and so on. Includes ensuring that there was capability building of the Maori people, and it was a really impressive process. The panel, there were 3 panelists with expertise in that particular protocol, and the panel were seriously influenced in how we made decisions about the funding through the Maori perspective, and it was a fantastic process to be part of. It'd be good to see that sort of thing happening in Australia too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're getting there.
Yeah.
And Bill, you're involved a lot in training data scientists.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what you're doing to make sure that people are designing ethical technology?
Yeah, so we run a bunch of different... Actually, there's a masterclass here for 2 hours, a little mini masterclass if anyone's interested. One of our Lachlan McCalman's doing a mini course. But what we're doing, we're training in large corporates and in government agencies. We're training the data scientists to do what they do more ethically at a deep technical level. And that includes things like, how to, if you're doing machine learning, how you validate a model, but not only just that, how validated models fail and so on. So typical ways things fail. What happens, people use existing data to build a model to do predictions and interventions, but the world's constantly changing, right? And you can't just, machine learning systems, you can't just set and forget and just leave, because the world's changing all the time, and you could very easily be creating disparate treatment for different genders and races and other aspects where if you don't very carefully have human governance over your AI system. So we teach people how to do good governance of AI systems, but also how to actually do the data science. So we get, after the data science course, we often get comments at the end saying, gee, I've been doing machine learning for 5 years and I didn't realise how much damage I was causing. So it's quite scary actually when you realise how much, even people who've just recently done machine learning courses where they just don't realise how much damage they can do by bad predictions and bad data hygiene and bad, even simple things like how you treat missing data, how you actually impute the data that's missing. The way you choose to do that can have, impacts on minority groups, serious impacts on minority groups. If you're doing something like, social service payments or tax audits, whatever you're doing, or mortgage, applications, you can actually start creating divides in society just because of the automation at scale, the automated decision making at scale. So you just need really good human governance over these systems. So we're just trying to build up the capability across the whole of Australia, so Australia becomes a country which is actually using AI with positive impact on society rather than having all the sorts of issues that happen elsewhere.
And what sort of level do you think we're at now? Like when you're going in and starting, how aware are people of these
There's
kinds of issues?
There's a lot of interest. Actually, I think people are just starting to hit up against the issues now.
Yeah.
People are reading the headlines, people are seeing some of the disasters, and people are coming to us for training and for helping them design systems quite a lot. So there's starting to be some awareness out there. It's an interesting space at the moment because there's a lot of talk about ethics of AI, but a lot of that talk is sort of very high level about, do no harm or things like that, which doesn't actually help someone design a system because the harm is created in a really subtle ways that are down at the data level, at a very technical level. And you can have the best intention in the world and still create a really harmful system.
Yeah.
So you have to make sure that you've got the right technical expertise, the right governance, the right measurement and monitoring, and that you're thinking really hard about what could go wrong, and you're making sure that it doesn't. And technology is really attractive. People think, wow, let's just go and use it. But you have to think as well, and think about, well, who's going to be impacted by this? What are there minority groups who aren't represented adequately in the data, such that our predictions are going to be more accurate for some parts of the population than other parts of the population? Things like that.
And I guess technology is already very embedded in our lives. And Dana, when we spoke before, I think you used the phrase that technology runs and research walks.
Yeah, technology flies. And
That's right.
research
Yeah.
walks. And I think I think that's one of the biggest issues for me as a researcher is how do we keep up with it? So we've got all this technology coming out, different devices and the different things that we can do with different devices. And as a researcher, I go, okay, well, I want to test what that's doing to people's brains, for example. So I set up a great experimental design for it, and then I go through my 3-month ethics process, and then, maybe I apply for funding first, and that takes a year, and then I do my ethics process, and then I set it all up, and I do run a trial, and it needs to be longitudinal, right? Because I don't need to know, I need to know what's happening in people's brains now, but I also need to know the long-term effects of it. And then about 5 years later, I've got my results and I'm ready to, and I'm going to publish. And since then, 57 new technologies have come out in the area, and I'm back at the beginning of it again going, right, how do I test this? And I think that's one of the real concerns for me. As a neuroscientist, that's one of the real concerns with me with a lot of our technologies is we don't know the effects on people's brains. And I'm very aware that, years ago we were saying we don't know the effects of television on people's brains. And years and years and years before that, Plato was saying these books are terrible for us, Man will never remember another word. Books are evil. And so everything comes around. Now screens are evil. And the brain is incredibly adaptive, and I'm quite sure we're all going to be fine, but I'd still really like to test it. And I think that's the problem with lots of our technologies. They just move so quickly, and we don't really have any, by the time we've got the stop guards in place, something new's out. And it's the same with hacking and things like that. By the time we understand one algorithm, they've learnt a different way of getting to things. So you feel like you're constantly running to catch up with technology. And I don't see that changing.
Angie, I know Old Ways New, you do service design, but you also have got a research arm as well. Do you feel that research is a bit behind, or do you think that it can catch up?
I also feel the same. I think that the way that we work is actually far, far, far different to most technologists and researchers, actually. So my uncle, he instilled in me this key term Injamara, which is actually a Wiradjuri word for, which means to do the act of doing with respect, with resonance, and slowly. And he's just recently passed on now, but he would always pull me up. He was a futurist and loved technology and was very much at the core of the company as a founder and advisor and an elder to the company. But he would always, even though he was always interested in bleeding edge technology, he would pull me back and always say, slowly, slowly. And so, it comes back to what we've been talking about. I think there's a bit of tension between, ethics and this question of whose ethics and law, and they're quite different, I think. And we were talking before about there's traditionally you don't go near anything until there's law associated with it, and there's LORE, which is it includes LAW, it includes science, psychology, so religion, but it's also an action guide to living and understanding the world. So LORE, also interchangeable with the dreaming or Jukapra, is what's applied to all things. So there's law around it. There's law that, I guess, informs our interrelational and contextual understanding of all things and how everything interrelates and interconnects. So when there's no law around technology, it's really concerning. And so we need to understand what the impacts are, and whether it's ethics frameworks or which I'm a little bit sus on because it's such a buzz. It's been hijacked by everybody. But I think what I'm really interested in is seeing how local legislation can incorporate both human and environmental rights. And I think it's really important to note because there's once again there's this assumption that human rights is going to human rights is at the centre of technoethics, When in actual fact, I think we just need to look across the ditch and look at what's going on in New Zealand and with earth rights and, having the rights of mountain, rights of the river, and have really created a different way for what I can see technology's evolution, because it has a much deeper relational context to place and also to communities and the social and environmental sustainability of this planet, as opposed to just humans.
And I guess the sort of the idea was, we sort of talked a little bit about it as if the technology development is separate from the ethical research of the ethical side of things, but really they kind of need to become more in sync. So that we sort of know what these outcomes are before, or we've thought about what the outcomes might be before we're putting these technologies out into the world. But I guess technology and ethics has become a bit of a hot topic at the moment. Do you think there's enough people thinking about it and researching it? That's a question for...
So I don't think there's enough technical people doing it. There's a lot of policy and legal people talking about it, and I worry that some new policies will not be technically informed enough. And so one of the things we're trying to do is make sure there's good... We're working very close with the federal government and the state government, New South Wales state government, on their approach, making sure that it is sound technically, because it's really easy to come up with some broad sort of statements that that actually make no pragmatic, cannot be implemented pragmatically. And you have situations where if you end up with laws or guidelines that are all about the ethical intent, you'll have companies who tick lots of boxes and say, yes, we have this ethical intent.
Yeah.
But the reality is, if there's no mapping from the technical intent to the actual outcomes of the systems they're developing, because they don't know how to actually convert intent into actual practice, then it's a waste of time. It's worse than a waste of time, because they tick all the boxes and they think they're doing a good job when they're not. So you need that you do need more. So yes, it'd be great if there's more technical people involved in helping. Both actually, it's still from a research point of view, from a computer science research point of view, ethical AI is still very young and still a lot of work to be done in that field. We're a research institute set up to work on the research of that, but there's all sorts. There's more talk than there is actual good work coming out at the moment.
Okay. And Dana, I was wondering if you could just talk us through a little bit of your work about how you're developing inclusive technologies in the medical space.
Yeah, so I think the key word in that is inclusive. So a lot of the stuff where we're building technologies is being built with, for example, Autism CRC, and they've come to us and said that they are looking for ways to facilitate participation in tertiary education for people with autism. And so we co-designed and co-built a chatbot for people with autism going through tertiary education at school with them. So they were able to be involved in the project in 4 different ways. They could design content for it. They could tell, so we got together and had a focus group, which you would call maybe a yarning circle or something like that. We had a focus group and we talked there a lot about what were the challenges, what were the things they enjoyed about university, what were the challenges, those sorts of things, so they could put content in. We then had a remote portal where people could come in and they could, anywhere in Australia, anybody on the spectrum, and that was widely advertised through places like Aspect and Autism Hub, which is part of Department of Education in Queensland, that are specifically focused on children with autism. And so anybody from Australia could key in and add, and it was all moderated, like we were a bit careful about what was going in there and how any of the overlaps. And then we had the testing of the bot, so we had this new bot. We wanted to call her Aura. It's for Autism University Research. I can't remember what the A stood at the end, for something. But there are so many things out there called Aura that we just couldn't do it. So that was really unfortunate, because it was one of the kids that we were working with had suggested it, and she was really keen on it. We would have loved to have given her that. But I think that's part of it too. So they're coming up with the names. That gives you a bit of ownership as well. And it's currently being trialled. So it's a really lovely piece of technology that's been designed. But autism is one of those areas where we go back to that balance. We talk about slowly, and yet kids with autism gravitate towards technology. They really, really do. and they can't take their devices into mainstream schools because you're not allowed to have devices in mainstream schools, right? And yet we've got parents out there going, this is the way my child learns. Can they please have the devices in school? So we've got all these systems set up so that, you know, and that everybody has to go through. And yet we've got these kids sitting outside of it that technology would really benefit if we could just move a little faster in that area. And yet in other areas we need to back off and move a little slower. So there's all this balance around it. And I think autism is one of those areas where, you know, technology maybe isn't moving fast enough. So, you know, they've got, and this is their world. This is the way their brains think. A lot of them, every brain is different in autism. There's no two that are the same. But one of the things that or some of the characteristics are high attention to detail, high ability to focus, very linearly thinking. And so they're the kind of people that would be perfect for your masterclass, right? They're the ones that they're going to come out the top of it. And so, yeah, maybe this is an area where we need to move a little faster.
And can you talk us through a little bit about what the process of getting ethics clearance is and how you think about ethics when you're approaching a project like that?
Yeah, we love it. It's our favourite part. CSIRO has really strict ethics protocols, probably the strictest of any research organisation in Australia. People are quite surprised at what we need to get ethics for. But I actually think it's a good thing. I think it covers everybody. And I get a little bit concerned because some companies say, you know, if we just want people to come to workshops and chat, we need to get ethics for that. It's low risk ethics. It takes half an hour to do. But the companies are saying, oh, we're not allowed to do research, so we can't come to that. But nobody else would call it research. Only CSIRO would call it research. And we need to be really careful because we are Australia's largest research organisation. So there's some fraught things there. But there's several layers of ethical approval. There's a low-risk process that you can go through, and as I said, that one's super quick, takes about half an hour. If you are talking to a human and you want to know what they say and you want to record that information, you need ethics for that. And it doesn't matter what setting it's in, whether you're going to publish it. If you're interested to know what that person's saying and you're going to record it, write it down or remember it in any way, you need ethics for that. Data sets, publicly available data sets. So we might have the ABC data set or the ABIDE data set, which is the autism data set, and we might want to go through, this is public available, it's on a website, we might want to go through and have a look at the size of the hippocampus and see if the morphology changes across different subsets of autism. We need ethics for that. And then we have full processes where we have a full committee for ethics, which is in any working with any population group that's considered vulnerable, so or that have been treated badly in the past, for example. So, and then we have that full committee sits. Those pages, one of them that we did for the Smarter Safer Homes project, this was in-home monitoring of beautiful elderly people who were all in their 70s and 80s, and we had sensors all around the house, passive sensors, no cameras. 65 pages the first ethics draft was, and I think the final draft came back around 85. That was fun. But our elderly were well protected. We looked after them.
And I think you mentioned as well that, you know, sometimes particular communities aren't ready for technology.
Yeah, I think, so a really good example of that is we developed a remote technology for cardiac rehabilitation. So if you have a heart attack and you don't do the rehabilitation, chances are you'll have a second heart attack within 4 years, and that one will get you. So if you have a heart attack, or if your mum or your dad or somebody you know has a heart attack, get them to do the rehabilitation. It's only 6 weeks and it staves them off. But a lot of people don't do it because they want to go back to work, or they're busy, or they don't want to go to the hospital. So we developed a mobile rehabilitation. It's platform technology, health diary on your phone, plus information that you can send back on, you know, your weight and blood pressure, temperature, a few other medical devices that were linked up to it. Clinical portal at the other end, so the clinicians can go in, they can have a look at your risk factors, how many cigarettes you've had, how much alcohol you've had, those sorts of things. And then there's a phone call that they can make to you, that they make for each of the 6 weeks of the cardiac rehabilitation. And instead of spending the first half an hour of that phone call saying, what did you do last Tuesday, what did you do last Wednesday, they were just able to look at the technology. Most of you are familiar with platform technologies now, I'm quite sure. So resource materials sent through to them, that sort of thing, that was part of the technology. Worked really well, greater uptake, greater adherence, greater completion. So more people wanted to do the mobile one, more people did all the different sections of it, watched the video, recorded their diary, sent their information back, that sort of thing. More people actually got through and completed the 6-week rehabilitation course, and better secondary outcomes. So the secondary outcomes for us were the health outcomes, fitness, depression, that sort of thing, much better. Queensland Health came to us and said, that's fantastic, can you modify it for an Indigenous population? So we went, okay, we can do that. So we talked a bit with Yarrabah up on the, just off Cairns, and Yarrabah are a remote community. They're an hour's drive out of Cairns. Connectivity isn't great. They'd never had a technology for mobile health before, and there was a real gap there to bridge. They were interested, but it hadn't been driven by their community. They hadn't put their hand up and said, we really want this, can you bring it to us? So we then worked with an Indigenous provider at the Institute for Urban Indigenous Health, fabulous people in Queensland, in Brisbane, and he said, you can't just go out there and take that out to a remote community. You need to start in a metropolitan community and gradually work your way out to rural, regional, and finally remote. Sounded like really good advice to me. So we modified it with a couple of mobs in metropolitan Brisbane, one at the Gabba, one down on the Goldie. I got the Goldie job. It was terrible. Had to drive down there every week onto the coast. God, the things they make you do. Anyway, working with these mobs. I was in a gym, which kind of put me into a bit of a state of shock, but that's okay, I got through it. But we worked with them, we modified the technology and got it to the point where it was ready to take out to that next level. Had we gone straight to Yarrabah, we wouldn't have it just wouldn't have worked. They weren't ready for it, they didn't want it. And there's no point going, Queensland Health or CSIRO saying, oh, we've got this really great thing, you know, here, have it. We don't want to do that anymore, you know.
We're going to go to questions shortly. So we've got some people with a couple of microphones go around, so if you want to put your hand up if you've got questions. But before we do, I'll just, for our final question, I guess I'll just ask, what do you think we need to change and to get better at that would make a big positive difference to a more inclusive future with technology? Bill, I'll start with you.
Okay. It's sort of, I've said a lot on that already, but it really is a recognition that it's not enough. There's a lot more that we can do with technology than we should do with technology. Because there is a mindset within technologists that if you can do it, then you should do it, and it just should not be like that, right?
Yep.
And I think we need better ethical culture within technologists to, because I mean, if anyone's seen the Netflix thing about is it Great Hack or Big Hack? Great Hack about Netflix. There was this really nice, the central character through that clearly had no moral understanding of what, it was just doing stuff because they could and they were getting paid to do it. And whereas they just didn't question their actions. You need technologists questioning their actions, thinking, slowing down, thinking about what they're doing, thinking about the impacts of what they're doing. So we need better ethical education for all technologists and better ethical culture within all companies that are building technology and using technology. Yeah. And I'll leave it at that.
Okay.
That's one thing. and just capability in general, and a recognition that machine learning isn't. Don't believe a snake oil salesman who tries to sell you a machine learning system and saying that just apply this to your data. You can easily do things really badly. So you need to to think, slow down, and have a good ethical culture.
Yep.
Yeah, I would say how we understand protocols is that it's the repetition of an action until it becomes the norm. And so just like, waking up in the morning and brushing your teeth, don't even think about it, you just do it. And I think that the ethics around, in particular, machine learning right now needs to be instilled in process before we end up in a really dire situation beyond what we've even, can imagine. I think it's not useful to be to freak out. I think it's really, I'm really positive about the opportunities and the reasons why we should explore, Indigenous AI and how machine learning can be imagined from a whole range of different processes. But I think that it's about the embedding of those ethical processes within the practice that will be it's critical that we get that right now.
Yeah. And Dana?
Yeah, I guess the inclusivity thing to me is really around that co-design and working with people and broadening out. I think diversity is great for gateways and checks and making sure that you're doing the right thing. I love that. Just because we can doesn't mean we should. It's a mantra that I think I first came across it when they wanted to put bat echolocation into a rat. We could do that. We can genetically code a bit of a brain that gives a rat bat echolocation. Why? Why would you do that? And I think that question needs to be asked a lot in technology and AI as well. Why would you do that? And I think the asking that question comes from having the right people in the room who are bringing it up. And so that's where mine is, that diversity of co-design.
Yeah. Great. Questions?
Hi. So first of all, a world where we've got bat rats is a world I want to live in. So it's Adam Berry from UTS. I guess a question mostly for you, Bill, which is recently Deloitte did a survey of 2,000 executives. Of those executives, 80% said that they've at least piloted some form of AI system. If I were having my guess, the number of those AI systems that meet rigorous ethical standards would be pretty low.
Very low, yeah.
So how much of what we can do actually addresses the fact that we've built a whole bunch of bridges and now we're saying, okay, how do we make them stay up? How much of that is a lost cause and how much of it is that we can solve it at the same time as trying to solve how we build these systems in the future?
I don't think there's any lost causes, really. I mean, if any system that's operating now can be measured and monitored, right? Just because you've already built it doesn't mean it's too late. It may be doing damage now. You just need to know that it's doing damage. So, but I do think so. There is a growing awareness. There is. It is the case that a lot of the techniques that need to exist don't exist yet. I mean, so the whole ethical AI is a very early in its research. There will be techniques coming out that make it easier to do some of these things, but they won't replace human thinking. Humans need to think and have good ethical governance, and you may as well get that in place now, even before the technologies are out there, because if you don't have good ethical governance, ethical technology governance, you're going to need it later. Get it in place now. And back to what I was saying before, that shouldn't be a checkbox thing saying yes, we're considering, yes, we have good ethical intent. You need, ethics is about ethical intent and ethical outcomes. It's not ethical if you just have an intent, right? It's like people saying, having some rules, don't kill people, but just go around killing people, right? Yeah, you need to make sure that you have both, and tying them together so that the ethical outcomes match the ethical intent. You need both, and so it's not too early for people to start adopting good practice. I mean, but it's a very fast, quickly evolving area. New South Wales government's doing some really interesting stuff. Victor Dominell is really big on trying to improve within companies that are operating within New South Wales, trying to help them understand how they can operate ethically. And he's putting on an AI summit in November, which is getting some people together to talk about how industry can actually build AI more ethically. And so I think New South Wales government are doing some really good work in this field. We're working with them on that. But and the federal government are about to release their ethical guidelines as well for AI, which D61 was involved in. And but the final version is still under development now. Yeah, no. Thanks, Adam, for the question.
G'day. Ben Morley-John with Smash Delta. We do data strategy principally in government and have bounced around a few areas of the economy. And I think if we were to define the market, our reflection is it's essentially siloed incentives. You've got a bunch of people who are on the hook for delivering something really quickly with AI and impactful with AI, and then you've got a completely separate bunch of people far removed from that who care about doing it ethically. And I guess my question is, and Bill, you touched on this earlier, how do you bring those two people together, or how do you get the people who are in charge with getting this very short-term AI-driven solution over the line to actually think long-term and think about different populations that might be affected, to think about the long-term ramifications, because we find it really difficult to have that conversation.
Can I just quickly on that. So when we're doing courses, we're doing courses at multiple levels, including the people who are responsible for AI systems and the people who are building them. And we're using common terminology across those. But the people who are responsible for AI systems, we're making sure they realise what can go wrong, right? You know, if they know what can go wrong, they're more motivated to making sure that it doesn't in their case, and giving them a language to talk to their technical people to actually start building those bridges. So if you want to talk to me after, I can tell you about what we're doing there. It's about education and it's about education and capability, really, I think. And a recognition that being ethical is good for business as well. It's not just about feeling good. It's actually about, you know, you will find there will be companies who will thrive through their reputation for ethical AI systems. And I think we're finding that now. A lot of the big corporates we're working with, they're getting involved in this because they know that it's good for business and necessary for business.
Yeah, and I would also say that there's a number of different things that need to happen. We need mandated legislation, but also the business sector to be engaged in that process, so that there's practical ways for the ethics and the principles and frameworks to be embedded within the practices of business. And so, I mean, I think that's starting to happen. We've been advising UNESCO, the UN General Assembly, and the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues around these ethical frameworks for various ethical frameworks for AI. And what I think is missing, though, is that we need nation states to then be able to have a much firmer grasp on what that relationship with business is, and how does it affect business, and then how does that then filter down into local legislation. So I think it's happening, but it's just slowly. I mean, right now, I'm super aware of the work that's going on in New South Wales. It's happening, but I think more engagement with the business sector would be, I think, a really positive thing to ensure that we've got practical ways to move forward.
Hi, I'm a student right now, and so my perspective is as one of those people who is going to not be a decision maker, but be someone who's just like doing technical things in the near future. So if I was working in a situation where the decision makers in an organization aren't necessarily trained in thinking ethically about their solutions, what suggestions would you have for someone like me who is trying to think about these things, but is working within that system?
Are you directing your question to any one of us, or?
No one in particular.
My advice would be to find the right people to work for. But Bill might have a better way.
No, that's a great answer, yeah.
Yeah, I would be looking for ethical companies to work for, and because especially if that's your question, then that's what you're already thinking. You're going to be incredibly unhappy working for somebody who doesn't have that same moral code, because you're going to be turning up every day doing things that make you feel really uncomfortable. So if that's where you're coming from now as a student, first of all, kudos to you. I admire you very much, and please come and work for me. And find an ethical employer. Absolutely. I'll give you my card. Come work for me.
Hi, I had a question.
Yep.
I'm from the Department of Education. Right, you talk about education, AI education, talk a lot about technology here. About technology, technologists being aware of implications and ethical implications. So what about the users? We are raising a digital generation. They are born with these technologies. Where do you think, as a nation, we should start with instilling that education from an early age? And that's one point. And second point is, should government be a bit more forceful around, what is allowed, in terms of, I mean, you mentioned that briefly, but, in terms of, we have financial regulations, we have lots of other regulations where it's not ethically allowed to do things that could harm other people. What about AI?
Do you want to take the first part and I'll take the second part, or?
No, you're right, you go.
Okay, so education. Yeah, it's a good question about education, about how we ensure that the users who are using technology care about the ethical implications, because there's lots of signs that they don't necessarily do that. I don't really have a good answer for the first one.
Do you?
Yeah.
I'll go there.
Yeah.
Maybe not terribly well, but I'll go there. So I actually think that what you raise is a really interesting question, and I've worked with some youth around technology development, and they have different ways of thinking to what that we the dinosaurs do, and so I think that there's going to be a meeting of the grounds. And so, yes, we can talk to them about the kinds of things that go wrong and lead by example with some of the mistakes we made, like with the Siri example I gave earlier. I think that kind of thing is something that our current population, it's not a mistake they would have made. They just wouldn't have made it. They think, their technology brains think more laterally than ours do, because it's still relatively new to us. As you say, they've grown up with them, they've developed them, they think very differently. I don't think they're as much of a concern as people are worried about. I actually think some of they're going to do amazing things. The youth of this generation coming through now are absolutely not to be underestimated. They are formidable, and I have nothing but admiration for them. I think that they're going to lead the way. I think some of the Indigenous youth are just incredible young people that are really going to show us how to walk side by side really, really well. I think the techno people that are coming through and just go, oh, you just do it like this. Sorry, you want me to wrap up, don't you? We're down to 30 seconds. I think that you're right to bring it up, but I think that there'll be a meeting of the minds, and I think that we'll be fine going forward. Did you want to answer the second question?
So just on regulation, so I think we have to be really careful about having any sort of generic sort of technology ethics or even AI legislation. I think I think there needs to be some regulation, but typically that'll be very specific to a particular application or sector.
There is for health.
So like health, for example. Yeah, health needs to be health specific. What the ACCC is looking at doing for social media, that makes sense for social media. But trying to have, it's like having laws for software. It just doesn't make sense. You can't. AI is like software; it's generic. You need to make sure that your laws are specific to a particular context, or it'd just be so general it won't really hold up.
Fortunately, we are out of time, so I'm sorry if you didn't get to ask the question you wanted to ask. One more? Okay, go for it.
Thanks very much. Mark, I do systems development. I missed the first minute, so you may have cut might have covered this, but we've been through cyber, and the security implementation of it being a little bit. And so we've now seen a learning from disasters. And so are we going to have to wait until we see AI disasters before we learn?
I hope not. That's what I was hoping these young kids are going to come in and do. I think that they've got the foresight. I think that they can think in terms of technology. I think that they see the dangers better than some of the other people do. Maybe your experience is
I
different.
think there already have been AI disasters, and I mean it's a bit like I was talking to someone at lunchtime about the relationship between AI and planes, right? Yeah, and aeroplanes. Yeah, they're both complex systems. Complex systems are really hard to manage and hard to manage all the risks associated with it. What needs to develop is the right culture within the industry. There needs to be the right regulation. There needs to be the right air crash investigations, the equivalent of air crash investigations. When things do go wrong, there are teams come together to look at it. It needs to be industry bodies setting standards and good culture. It will take time to develop where the level of quality that is you can assume in a plane is also in an AI system. It's going to take many different types of bodies, many different changes in culture. And we're talking decades away before we have that sort of attitude to quality. But ultimately, AI needs to up in its quality. At the moment, there's a lot of cowboys out there just doing all sorts of things. Yes, there have been some AI disasters. There'll be more AI disasters. Eventually, we'll get to a mature. Hopefully, we'll get to the type of maturity we have in planes, where yes, there's the occasional plane crash, but every time there's a plane crash, the chance of that particular incident happening again is reduced through the response to the investigations. Hopefully, we'll move to that sort of model. But one of the big differences, though, in planes is a very small number of companies who are building planes. In AI, there's thousands of organisations building AI systems, so it's going to be very messy, I think. It will be messy. There'll be big disasters. Yeah.
Thanks, everybody, for coming along, and thank you very much to the panel.
Thank you.